Lecture 6, reading from the console, variables, naming conventions, right? We're going to talk about how do we read from the console. And like I said last week, previously a lot of programs didn't have GUIs. You couldn't point and click, type in your answer, whatever. You had to use a console and even, or a command line. Even in Linux, you see that what we've been doing is command line. And command line can be tricky, but it's all up to the programmer on how they design the program to work with the command line. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're just going to review methods real quick. So remember, methods are callable functions. You can invoke them or call them within your program. What happens is you can put a block of code within a method. If you plan on running this code over and over and over again, instead of typing it over and over again, you just put it in a method and call your method. You can also, for different classes, it helps to retrieve data from that class or modify it, right? For example, if you remember last time we had our Ford Mustang, a friend asked the VIN number is, you have a method called getVINNumber that returns that VIN number to whoever's calling it. So when the program is actually running, what happens is your program runs statement, statement, statement. Once it gets to that method call, it switches over to the method, it runs all the code within that method, and then switches back to your program, right? And just to recap, last class we created our Mustang class. It's a red 2020 Ford Mustang with that VIN number. And then we had a method called getVINNumber, right? And all it does is return that VIN number. The program executes the code within this method until it reaches the end of the method, that closing bracket, or it hits a return statement. So let's walk through this. So you remember we're actually creating our Mustang, right? We're Mustang object. We are naming it my car. And then we're calling mycar.getVINNumber. We're using that method. All right. So let's trace through this. So just like the previous slide, we have Mustang mycar equals new Mustang. And what we're doing is creating that physical mycar Mustang object in memory, right? We're actually creating it based off the Mustang template or the class. All right, we have a variable. We want to store that VIN number in a variable so that we can use it within our main method, or else we could only use it inside the mycar Mustang object. So variable mycar_VIN, we set it equal to mycar.getVINNumber, right? And then I want to print to the console this variable right here, mycar_VIN. Ooh, my arrows are not very pretty. So the first line of execution is going to be creating the object, right? The second line is going to be creating that variable, then calling this method, right? Method invocation or method calling is execution switches to that method that we're calling. So the getVINNumber, execution will switch to that method, which is here inside the Mustang class. It'll run whatever code is inside this method right here until it hits a return statement or the ending bracket. Once that method completes, execution switches back to whatever called it, so the main method, and then we execute the next line of code, okay, which is the system.out.println. And that is printing that VIN number to the console. Any questions? Because we're going to switch gears right now. We're going to go into variables, strings, and ints. Any questions at all? All right, we'll continue. Now we're going to talk about how to read from the console. The console being the command line, right? How do we actually read from the command line? So the first thing we need to do is create a scanner object. Scanner is, it's a object, it's a class that lets you read from either the command line, the console, or from a file. Right? It's a very simple class that we're going to use in this course. We create the scanner object, we name it input, we use our new keyword to create the actual object for it, right? We actually want to use this. And then system.in tells it to read from the console. Sorry. So the scanner object is a built-in library which allows you to read from the console or from files, right? System.in tells that scanner object to read from the console. If I wanted to read from a file, let's call it students.txt. Right here, and this is red on red, so you might not be able to see where I'm scribbling. Right there, instead of file name, I would write in students.txt, and it will read from the file. All right. There are various methods you can use with the scanner object. You can use the next method, which gets the next word, whether it's a letter, whether it's a whole word, or it's a number. It gets whatever sequence of characters is next, separated by spaces. Next line gets the entire next line, and then it moves down to the next one. Next float and next int get the next float or integer respectively. A float is any number with a decimal. An integer is any number, a whole number. It doesn't have a decimal, right? However, when you do that, that value must be a float or it must be an integer. If it cannot be converted to an integer or a float, so it's not a 0, 1, it's not a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, then you will have an error in your program and it will crash, unless you check for that later. So here's an example, right? We have our scanner input equals new scanner. We are creating our scanner object and we're calling it input. And then we have these different lines of statements of code. Input.next, input.next line, input.next line, input.next. And we'll walk through how this works, okay? So input.next, well, the first step, obviously, is to create our scanner object. Input.next will read the first word, which is hello. Input.next line will read the next whole line, which is programming class after input.next. Input.next line again reads the entire next line. Input.next reads the next word. Okay, we'll go through that one more time. All right, so first we create our scanner object. Input.next reads the next word, one word. Input.next line reads the entire next line, right? Again, the entire next line, and then the next word, okay? Any questions? This is the meat and potatoes of this class and programming, so any questions so far? None? All right, I think a couple more people just, we'll continue. All right, so identifiers, it's the names we use. So if you look here, the identifier for the scanner is input. It's whatever we name our objects. We name our objects, our variables, whatever it is, our classes. So public class welcome is a identifier, whatever we name it. So names used for classes, the Mustang in this statement is the identifier for this class. Variables, string, make. String is just a type of variable that holds words or characters. Make. Get VIN number is identifier for a method, right? So sequence of characters cannot be true, false, or no. You can't use those. Those are keywords. subsequent words must start with a capital letter. And by that, I mean, so first, the first word get is lowercase, but then and number are both uppercase. Those are subsequent words. Right? They're within this full sequence identifier, and each subsequent word needs to be capitalized. And that goes for variables up here and methods. However, for classes, you want the first letter to be capitalized as well. Okay? So classes will always have a capital first letter. Computer is tripping. Okay, not this again. Hold on, y'all. My computer is having issues. Back at it. All right, we just talked about identifiers. All right, so these are some Java keywords, and we'll talk about these as we go throughout the class. Just know you cannot use these to name your classes, your variables, or your methods. They are reserved words. Some of these should look sort of familiar to you, such as public, let's see, return, let's see, we'll talk about float, char, class should look familiar, we'll talk about long, new should look familiar, let's see, double we'll talk about, byte we'll talk about, int we'll talk about. But as we go throughout, and short, as we go throughout this class, we'll talk about most of these keywords. So you shouldn't have to worry about them too much right now. Just know that you cannot name them. You cannot use them as an identifier for an object or a class or something like that. They are reserved words. All right, so let's talk about variables. So variables are used to store some type of data, either numbers, words, sentences, characters, and then you can also use them to store objects as well, but we'll get to that later. Variable types. These are the different variable types in this class. You also have, you know, you could use it to do the scanner and all that stuff, but the main types, or the most basic types, are these ones that you see on the screen right now. The first one is a byte. It's a very, very small number, only between -128 and 128. Next is a short, again, for small numbers. An int is for whole numbers, so whatever whole numbers you have, and it always rounds down. A long is for very large whole numbers. A float is for numbers with decimals. A double is for very large numbers with decimals. Then we have a char, which is for an individual character, so like an A or a B. And string, which can be a word, it can be an individual letter, or a whole sentence, a whole paragraph. It doesn't really matter. Strings hold all that stuff. In this class, let's simplify it. We'll mostly work with ints, floats, and strings, okay? That's the majority of the variables we'll work with. The other ones are important if you're doing other things, but in this class, those are the three main ones that we're working with. All right, so how do we actually declare a variable? Well, very simple. If you remember this example from earlier, I just declared a variable, string line, okay? That's a variable I just declared. Now I can use it in this variable declaration. If I switch this up a little bit, and I set line equal to all these different commands or statements, Now let's call it a variable assignment. I'm assigning something to that variable to store it, right? And so let's use this example again. So what I've changed is the string line. I created the variable. And I said line equal to each one of these statements, all right? So let's walk through this. The first statement declares the variable, so now it's stored in memory. Line equals null. The next line creates our scanner. Technically, the scanner is in memory as well, but we don't have to really focus on that. We create our scanner to read from the console. Now the first one, line equals input.next. Well, input.next is hello, so now line equals hello in memory. Okay? Input equals, or line equals input.next line. So the whole rest of the next line, you see down here, the variable line equals that in memory as well. We go to the next statement. This whole line, the variable line equals that as well. We go again. Next is right here, and you see right there in memory. All right. So I'm assigning whatever I'm reading from the console right here into the variable line. Right? And the way Java looks at it, it always executes the right side of that assignment statement first, and then puts it over there into the variable. Always does the right side first and puts it into the variable. All right, so what types of operators can we use with strings? Like, what can we do with them? If I have two strings, can I add them together? Can I divide them? Well, really, the main one is just concatenation, which is the plus sign. What it is combining two strings together. So if I have two strings, hello and world, and you notice there is a space right here. If I concatenate those two together, it just creates one string, hello world. Right, so that's string concatenation. It combines the two strings. It doesn't add them like a number. So let's use this for example. Again, I create a variable, string line. And each time I'm assigning it to something different. And down here I have some concatenation. So let's walk through this. So the first thing, I create my line. It's equal to null in memory. If I keep walking through these statements, it's going to change each time. It keeps changing, 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 changing. All right, so now line equals assignment, right? Well, this next statement over here is setting line equal to line plus space 3, okay? And again, Java always executes the right side first, right? This always goes first. So right now, a line equals assignment. And so when I execute this statement right here, it's going to add that 3 to that line variable. All right, so let's see. All right, now you saw here in memory, line now equals assignment 3. Any questions? Anything at all? Come on now. This is what you'll be working on this weekend.
I don't have no questions.
You say you do or you don't?
I don't.
All right. Okay. Well, we're going to keep going then. All right. So similar example, except now I create a new variable, string line 2 equal to 3. So if you see over here in memory, now I have that new variable, line 2. And down here, I'm setting line equal to line plus a space plus line 2. So I'm concatenating all 3 of these strings, because this space right here is technically a string as well, together. So line equals assignment. Line 2 equals 3. And then I'm going to do all this and set line equal to it. So if I do the next statement, you see over here, line has changed to assignment 3. Okay? That's string concatenation. That's how you concatenate strings together. For numbers, we have our basic mathematical operations, plus, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and remainder. So remainder is a little bit different. So when you divide by whatever this number is, it's going to take the remainder of that. So technically, this is not correct. This actually has a remainder of 0. But if I do this right here, 10, and that is called a modulo. Modulo, I hope I spelled that right. That's what the little symbol is called in this equation. 10 modulo 3, right? 3 goes into 10 3 times, right? 3, 6, 9, with 1 left over. So the answer to that one would be 1. Right? That's what you would get from that. Everything else is pretty much the same as you would expect. And you do have parentheses. So think, if you've ever used scientific calculators, that's how you would type in mathematical equations in code, using your parentheses for orders of operation, so on and so forth. Everything follows a scientific calculator or what you expect from a mathematical equation in terms of the operation, the order of operations. All right, so a numerical assignment example. Let's walk through this. So over here, I'm creating 4 variables, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm setting it equal to, number 1, now it's in memory, equals 7. Number 2 equals 4. 3 is 2.55. 4 is 3.21, right? I just created some variables. So now you can use the correct types to identify your variables. If you know it's going to be a whole number, use an int. If you know it's going to have decimal points, use a float. If you know it's a string or it's a word, a character, whatever, use a string. Now we can actually identify what type of variable we're looking at. Java is, I believe it's hard typed, I think is the term for it, or you must, or explicit type, you must identify what type of variable you're creating. In other languages, like Python and JavaScript, you don't have to say what type of variable you're creating. You just create the variable in the program. The language identifies what type it is. However, in Java, you must identify if it's an int, float, or string. You must. All right, so now let's do a numerical operation example. So we're actually subtracting and adding numbers together, right? So let's do number 1 equals number 1 minus 5, right? Well, currently, number 1 equals 7. So 7 minus 5 equals 2. And if you look over in memory, number 1 updates to 2. Next statement, number 1 equals number 1 plus number 2. Again, number 1 equals 2. Number 2 equals 4, right, in memory. So we add those two together and set that equal to number 1. So when they're added together, the sum is 6. And we set number 1 equal to 6. Okay? And that's it for today for the slides.